Imagine taking the Vatican, like its colossal stone walls, the Swiss guards, its absolute sovereign immunity.
Right, the whole package.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
Taking all of that, picking it up, and just dropping it squarely into the middle of the Himalayas. I mean, could a tiny, like 108-acre religious city-state actually solve one of the longest, most bitter geopolitical deadlocks of our modern era?
It sounds wild, but honestly, it is a fascinating structural blueprint.
It really is. Welcome to the Deep Dive Learner. Today is Wednesday, April 8th, 2026, and we are unpacking a really provocative 2023 academic paper. It's by Tennyson Samraj from the International Journal of Social Sciences and Management Review.
Yeah, the paper is titled Envisioning the Potala State Modeled After the Vatican State. And it's essentially a mechanical trifold framework.
Right.
It aims to resolve the decades-old conflict between Tibet and China. So it's attempting to balance this intense Tibetan desire for freedom, keeping in mind, the Dalai Lama has been in exile since March 31st, 1959.
Wow, that long.
Yeah. Balancing that with China's firm, unyielding claim of sovereignty over the region.
Now, before we really unpack the mechanics of this, I need to make the ground rules for today's deep dive crystal clear for everyone listening.
Absolutely. It's a heavy topic.
Right. Whenever we touch on topics that involve real-world geopolitics or, historical grievances or deeply held religious beliefs, we are stepping into highly charged territory.
Oh, for sure.
So in this deep dive, we are strictly exploring the author's theoretical framework and his historical comparisons. We are not taking sides.
Right.
We're not endorsing any particular political viewpoint, left, right, or center. Our goal here is purely analytical. We just want to take this proposed architectural solution apart, examine the mechanics of how it's actually supposed to work, and, well, see what insights we can pull from it.
I think that's the best way to approach it. It requires looking at international diplomacy not as an ideological battlefield, right?
Cool.
But more as an engineering problem. We are basically examining the load-bearing walls of the author's argument to see if the structure can actually stand up.
Exactly. So to understand the author's blueprint, we first have to figure out why the previous architecture kept collapsing. Like the UN, international diplomats, human rights organizations, they've all been trying to solve the Tibet issue since the 1950s.
Failing, basically.
Yeah, failing. Because the starting point of negotiations has historically always been the question of absolute sovereignty, like who owns the land top to bottom.
Right.
And when you frame the question that way, you can't split the baby. It is a binary, totally unresolvable deadlock.
Exactly. The author points out that in the modern era, the concept of a nation-state is intricately tied to land, language, and ideology. But for Tibetans, their historical aspirations have been this complex braid of two distinct things:
Which are?
political autonomy and religious freedom.
Oh, right. Because for centuries in Tibet, those two concepts were functionally identical. Like Lamaism operated as a theocracy.
Yes.
The Dalai Lama wasn't just a spiritual guide giving sermons. He was the head of the state. He ran the political machinery, collected taxes, managed civil laws, all of it.
Which is the exact core mechanism that made modern negotiations impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, if a state's entire identity and governance are defined solely by a religion, it operates as a fundamentalist state.
Right, by definition.
Right. And the modern secular international order bodies, like the UN, for example, they just don't have a clean, compatible slot for a fundamentalist state.
Yeah.
It creates this inherent friction with neighboring secular superpowers.
Okay, let's unpack this because this is the aha moment of the paper for me. By untying the knot between religion and politics, a massive geopolitical loophole suddenly opens up.
Yep.
You can't negotiate with a theocracy, but you absolutely can negotiate with a secular entity. And the really fascinating part is that this decoupling already happened. Like in 2011, there was a massive paradigm shift.
There was.
Yeah.
On March 10th of that year, the Dalai Lama officially stepped down from his temporal political title.
The Ganden Phodrang, right?
Yes, the institution known as the Ganden Phodrang. He willingly handed that political power over to the Tibetan government in exile, which is usually just called the TGIE.
That is just a staggering maneuver when you really think about the historical weight of it. It's almost like, imagine the founding monarch of a centuries-old empire willingly demoting himself, like a legendary CEO stepping down to become just the company's spiritual founder.
That's a really good way to put it.
He removes himself from the daily operational fights, the taxation, the civil disputes, and he elevates his role. And mechanically, by doing that, he fundamentally changes who the opposing side has to sit across from at the negotiating table.
Exactly.
The Chinese government is no longer negotiating with a theocratic monarch. They are looking at a secular civil government in exile.
And the author views that 2011 separation of church and state as the absolute prerequisite for any viable peace framework.
Without that, none of this works.
Right, none of it. As long as the Dalai Lama represented a competing political authority over Chinese territory, there could be no movement.
Mm.
But by shedding that political apparatus, he changed the entire equation.
It's brilliant, really.
It is. The paper argues that in the modern secular world, you basically have to separate the spiritual aspiration from the political machinery if you want a culture to survive.
But that raises a huge question. If the religion and the state are now legally separated, where does the religion actually go physically? I mean, the Dalai Lama has been leading from exile in India for decades.
Yeah, since 1959.
Right. So the author's answer is to create a physical sovereign anchor. He calls it the Potala state. And this is where that Vatican comparison we talked about really comes into focus.
It does. The author leans heavily into the 1929 Lateran Treaty. And to understand the mechanics of this proposal, we really have to look at that Italian precedent.
Okay, take us back to 1920s Italy.
So before 1929, the Catholic Church and the Italian government were locked in this bitter, decades-long standoff.
Yeah.
The unification of Italy had basically consumed all the old papal states.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, leaving the Pope essentially trapped inside the Vatican walls, just flat out refusing to recognize the Italian government.
So it's just a total diplomatic freeze.
Exactly. Mussolini and Pope Pius XI eventually realized that this friction was just draining resources on both sides. So they struck this deeply pragmatic deal. Italy carved out a micro-territory, exactly 108 acres in Rome, and declared it the Vatican City state.
But the key to the Lateran Treaty wasn't just like drawing a line on a map, right? It was the specific logistical mechanisms it established.
That's the crucial part, yeah.
The Vatican was granted absolute neutrality. It was given its own internal security, the Swiss Guards, and full ownership of its tiny territory. But importantly, it relied entirely on Italy for its broader defense, its postal service, its water supply, all that surrounding infrastructure.
It is a state embedded within a state, connected by like logistical umbilicals.
I love that phrase, logistical umbilicals. So the author suggests dropping this exact logistical framework onto the Potala Palace in Lhasa.
He does.
For anyone who hasn't seen it, the Potala Palace is this breathtaking, towering fortress complex built right into the side of a mountain. It's historically split into two parts, right?
Yes, the White Palace and the Red Palace.
Right. The White Palace, or Patrang Karpo, which was the seat of the government, and the Red Palace, the Patrang Marpo, devoted entirely to Buddhist prayer and study. The proposal is to declare this specific footprint a neutral, limited, sovereign state specifically for the practice of Lamaism.
And the idea is that the Dalai Lama would return to become the temporal head of this tiny enclave. So he'd be administering those 108 acres, so to speak.
Right, just the palace grounds.
Yeah, but he would remain strictly the spiritual leader to the millions of Tibetan Buddhists outside its walls.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, but also where I have to push back a bit on the author's historical comparison.
Okay, let's hear it.
The Vatican survived World War II without being bombed, largely because of its unique location in Europe, right? Like the overwhelming Catholic population of the surrounding military powers, and honestly, a lot of historical luck.
That's true.
So, is it genuinely practical to just copy-paste a 1920s European treaty into modern Asian geopolitics? I mean, the Potala Palace doesn't have its own power grid. It's deeply integrated into the modern Chinese city of Lhasa.
That is a very fair critique.
Yeah.
But the logistical integration is precisely why the author thinks the Vatican model works. He isn't suggesting the Potala state become some self-sustaining fortress.
Oh, okay.
He's suggesting a mechanical treaty of absolute neutrality. Like, the Vatican doesn't generate its own electricity, right? It buys it from Italy under the terms of the treaty.
Okay, that makes sense.
A Potala state would operate the exact same way. The central mechanism is that the Potala state must possess its own internal security force to police the temple grounds. That maintains strict internal peace, so the host nation doesn't have any excuse to intervene.
Meaning the enclave completely recuses itself from global geopolitics. They don't have a foreign policy. They don't forge military alliances.
Exactly. That absolute neutrality is the ultimate trade-off. If the Potala state remains strictly neutral, it ceases to be a political threat. It basically grants the religion a permanent, unassailable headquarters without challenging the overarching political power of the nation that surrounds it.
Okay, so creating a localized spiritual sanctuary makes sense on paper. But if the Potala Palace becomes this highly restricted enclave just for the Dalai Lama and his monks, what happens to the civil society?
The everyday people.
Right. What happens to the millions of everyday Tibetans living outside those walls? I mean, they still need schools, businesses, civil laws.
And that question leads directly to the second pillar of the author's trifold solution. The paper proposes that the broader Tibetan region, like everything outside the newly drawn walls of the Patala state, becomes a secular state governed by the TGIE.
The Tibetan government in exile.
Right. And it would operate on a model very similar to Hong Kong.
Oh, wow. So we were talking about applying the one country, two systems principle.
Yes, exactly. Under this structure, Tibetans would gain internal self-governance. They would hold free elections to choose local leaders, manage their civil society, and structure their internal economy.
That's a huge shift.
It is. And this secular civil structure would also create a legal pathway for the vast Tibetan diaspora. The generations of people who fled over the decades.
They could finally return.
Exactly. They could return and preserve their culture within a functioning modern society.
I want to pause on the concept of a secular state for a second, because the definition of that word radically changes depending on where you are in the world.
Oh, absolutely it does.
Right. Like when a lot of people hear secular, they think of the French model of laïcité, which is a system that actively pushes religion completely out of a public square, like suppressing outward religious expression.
Yes.
But the author is utilizing a much different structural definition here, isn't he?
He is. He goes to great lengths to define secularism, not as the suppression of religion, but as absolute state neutrality.
State neutral.
Yeah. In this framework, a secular state simply means the government does not patronize, fund, or legally elevate any single faith over others. It basically acts as a structural firebreak.
The paper drops a really striking line about this mechanism. I wrote it down. The author writes, "Religion, independent of secularism, is a formula for chaos."
It's a powerful quote. And the underlying logic is that if you grant robust political autonomy to a deeply religious population without implementing strict secular safeguards, you risk birthing a new fundamentalist state.
Right, because the majority just imposes its religion on everyone else.
Exactly. And fundamentalist states inherently struggle because they attempt to legislate spiritual beliefs rather than civil behaviors. So by ensuring the broader Tibetan region remains strictly secular and neutral, you protect the civil rights of every resident.
So what does this all mean for the average person? It's like having a designated quiet car on a train, right?
I like that.
That's the Patala state. While the rest of the train is bustling, secular, and democratic, everyone gets what they need without taking over the whole train. A localized spiritual core surrounded by a neutral civil buffer.
That's a perfect analogy.
It's an elegant theory. But look, in realpolitik, the entity driving the train, in this case, China, doesn't just give away train cars out of the goodness of its heart.
No, they certainly do not.
A superpower has absolute military and economic control over the region. So what is the mechanical, pragmatic incentive for them to cede even an inch of sovereignty and allow local democratic control? I mean, superpowers don't usually hand over internal control just because you ask nicely.
And that is the highest hurdle of the entire proposal. The author addresses this in the third pillar of his framework. Tibet must fully and unequivocally accept Chinese overarching sovereignty.
Wait, really? So, which means the Tibetan government in exile officially abandons the dream of total independent nationhood.
Yes, they would have to consign all foreign policy, international trade agreements, and national defense matters entirely to Beijing.
Wow. That is a massive concession.
It is. But the author frames this within the hard realities of superpower hegemony. Whether we look at the United States, Russia, or China, superpowers do not voluntarily surrender geographic territory within their immediate spheres of influence.
Right. It just doesn't happen.
It doesn't. So the paper argues that Tibetans must maneuver within the pragmatic reality of that hegemony rather than fighting an unwinnable war of attrition against it.
Okay, handing over foreign policy is a huge concession from Tibet, but is giving up foreign policy truly enough of a carrot for a superpower? Like, why wouldn't China just continue the status quo of total administrative control?
To understand the incentive, the author points to the cost of the status quo. Trying to forcibly suppress a deeply held spiritual and cultural identity creates a permanent, resource-draining internal insurgency.
It's expensive.
Incredibly expensive. It requires endless capital spent on security, policing, and international reputation management.
It's like an earthquake fault line, if you think about it. If you lock the tectonic plates tightly together through sheer force, the pressure builds and builds until you eventually get a catastrophic earthquake like a fundamentalist uprising.
That tectonic analogy is highly appropriate, yeah.
But if you engineer a system that allows a small, controlled slip, a tiny sovereign space, and localized civil control, the pressure safely vents. The host nation keeps its overarching territory intact, but the existential friction just disappears.
Exactly. The author argues that governments ultimately cannot successfully legislate morality or culture from the top down
Yeah.
without burning immense political capital.
Right.
Furthermore, the paper highlights a key phrase. The story of China is a story of change.
They are adaptable.
Very. Over the last 40 years, China has proven to be fiercely pragmatic. I mean, they completely restructured their economic model to adopt state capitalism. They engineered complex, unprecedented economic ties with Taiwan. They implemented the one country, two systems model in Hong Kong to preserve global financial stability.
So the premise is that superpowers are not these rigid monoliths. They are adaptable when an alternative system offers a higher return on investment.
Precisely. By granting Tibetans legislative authority over their own internal social behavior, China achieves permanent regional stability.
They neutralize a 60-year-old international human rights thorn.
Yes, gaining immense global goodwill. And they do it without actually losing their sovereign borders or compromising their national defense shield.
It's a win-win in the context of realpolitik. China secures its geopolitical borders, and Tibet secures its cultural and spiritual survival.
That's the argument, yeah.
You know, what fascinates me is that the author doesn't just treat this as a bespoke solution just for the Himalayas. He actually takes this intricate Vatican-Potala framework and scales it up.
He really does.
He suggests this specific blueprint could act as a universal template to diffuse religious conflicts globally.
Yeah, the paper transitions from a regional proposal into a much broader geopolitical philosophy at the end. The author observes that the proliferation of fundamentalist states, or movements trying to establish them, is one of the most volatile dangers in the modern world.
Without a doubt.
When a deeply held religious identity lacks a physical, secure home, it inevitably clashes with the secular governments hosting it. The friction becomes explosive because the believers feel their very existence is being, administratively squeezed out.
So, by granting a highly restricted, geographically tiny sovereign enclave to a major religion, you satisfy the existential need for a physical homeland.
Yeah.
You give the faith an anchor.
Exactly.
It's almost like a geopolitical pressure release valve. If you give a deeply held faith a localized sovereign vent, it prevents the pressure from turning the entire surrounding country into a fundamentalist state. And paradoxically, providing that anchor allows the much larger surrounding nations to remain comfortably secular and democratic.
Because the religious population no longer feels like they have to take over the government just to protect their faith.
Right. Does the author give any other examples of where this could work?
He does provide some really bold theoretical examples. He envisions the potential for a Khalsa state for Sikhs, which could operate as a sovereign micro-enclave adjoining the Golden Temple in Amritsar, India.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he even suggests the theoretical framework could be applied to create a sovereign caliphate state adjoining Mecca. That would provide a neutralized spiritual center for the global Muslim faith without requiring a sprawling political empire.
Tiny, neutral, heavily secured pinpricks of sovereignty scattered across the map, acting as the spiritual hearts for billions of people, while the rest of the map just gets on with the business of secular civil governance. It's an incredibly striking way to reimagine global borders.
It really connects to a profound philosophical realization presented at the very end of the paper. The author notes that the fundamental human right to life must inherently include the right to have a place to live.
That's heavy.
It is. History is basically a graveyard of permanent empires. No nation, no border, and no political system lasts forever in its original state.
Geopolitically speaking, we're all just renting space on the map. The lines are always shifting.
And because those lines shift, if we want to survive as a diverse, globalized species, we have to engineer creative mechanisms to share the planet. The author posits that blending localized spiritual sovereignty with overarching secular governance might actually be the most stable architectural template we have.
It honors the deep human need for the sacred.
Right, while maintaining the robust secular infrastructure required for modern, diverse societies to function alongside one another.
It really makes you view the globe through an entirely different lens. So, to bring this all back home, the deep dive we've taken today into Tennyson Samraj's 2023 paper leaves us with a highly engineered, trifold mechanism to resolve the Tibetan deadlock.
Just to recap the pillars.
Right. Pillar 1, A Vatican-style Patala state, carving out 108 acres of limited sovereignty and strict neutrality for Lamaism. Pillar 2. A Hong Kong-style secular democracy for the Tibetan people to govern their own daily lives, culture, and diaspora. And Pillar 3, overarching Chinese sovereignty over defense and foreign policy, appeasing the pragmatic realities of superpower hegemony.
It is a delicate, complex web of compromises. But as the underlying logic of the paper suggests, mechanical compromise is really the only sustainable alternative to permanent resource-draining deadlock.
The friction has to go somewhere. And as we wrap up today's exploration, I want to leave you, the learner, with a thought to mull over. We've spent this entire time dissecting the mechanics of physical land, right?
Yeah, borders and acreage.
Like 108 acres in Rome, the exact geographic footprint of the Potala Palace, the physical borders of a theoretical Khalsa state. The author's entire framework relies on the premise that global religions fundamentally require a physical sovereign space to survive and feel secure.
Which has historically been true.
But look at the trajectory of the world we are living in right now. In an increasingly digital, hyper-interconnected society where communities exist across continents in real time, is physical sovereign territory still the ultimate requirement for a religion's survival?
That is a fascinating question.
Right. Or, as we move deeper into the 21st century, will the Vaticans of the future be entirely borderless? Could a global faith eventually find its ultimate security not behind stone walls and physical security guards, but in the decentralized sovereign networks of the digital world?
It's definitely something to think about.
It's a massive question about the future of human belief. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the architecture of the world around you, keep learning, and we will catch you next time.